We as a society are so focused on convenience when it comes to food that we tend to ignore nutrition, and we see that in our health bills, our medical bills and things like that, obesity rates, cancer rates. People are not feeding themselves well because they don't take the time to feed themselves well.
Something to Chew On is a podcast devoted to the exploration and discussion of global food systems. It's produced by the Office of Research Development at Kansas State University. I'm Maureen Olevnik, Coordinator of Global Food Systems.
I'm Scott Denona. I'm a philosopher of science.
And I'm John Fabian. I'm a food scientist.
Hello, everybody, and welcome back to Something to Chew On. In this episode, we will be discussing the complexity of teaching and producing healthy, affordable, local food. Our featured guest, Dr. Jeremy Cowan, Assistant Professor of Sustainable Food Production Systems, focuses on regenerative agriculture and specialty food crop systems and explores the possible contributions of biodegradable plastics and permaculture, an agricultural system or method that integrates human activity with natural surroundings to create self-sustaining ecosystems. His work focuses on training future growers and eaters the importance of growing food with people in mind at every point along the production-consumption loop. As the land-grant university, we are challenged to teach, learn, and research ways to feed the world. Food production can include everything from large-scale growing and processing of food products to small backyard gardens. Local fresh produce has long been lacking in most diets, and questions on the sustainability of current large farming practices is top of mind when considering our long-term ability to produce food. Another major consideration of food production is one that we probably don't often consider, and that is the social implications of moving off the land. So, where does the small farm fit in today's food production realm? Welcome to the podcast, Jeremy.
Thank you. Happy to be here.
Your area of expertise is in small farming, which I am sure as we get through this discussion is going to be explained in much more detail on what small farming actually means. In the past, we've done several podcasts with researchers on campus that have talked about very interesting research in soils, soil health, microbiology in various areas. And it seemed to me that a lot of that research is more geared towards large-scale farming. Having listened to all of those and really thinking about what you do, though, I think there's probably a good potential for a lot of that information to have direct impact on what you're doing as well. So I would like to get into a little bit more of that, hopefully, as we talk through this. But initially, I'd like to step back and learn a bit more about you, how you got interested in this, and what brought you to K-State.
Wow, that's a story that could go way back. So
a lot of them do.
For me, so when I started my undergrad, I was a poli-sci major. I was planning to go to law school and then be a staffer for some congressman somewhere and get into politics. And that didn't work out for my family too well. And about a year from finishing that degree, I was faced with the choice to change majors. And I had a really hard time with that because I think the dominant social expectation is that you go to college to get a high-paying job, and the path that I had looked at taking would have been decent, or at least I thought it would have been decent in that regard. And all of the other ones that had any kind of interest to me would have set me back a year or two in college. And so I sat back and had some reflective time and thought to myself, well, what do I enjoy? Because you can still go to law school with any degree. And so I thought back to some of my pre-adolescent years when I felt motivated to go start a garden in my parents' backyard and how much I enjoyed that process. And so I figured, I looked at the requirements of a horticulture degree, and it would have only set me back one more semester from what I was currently on, because I had picked up a few courses that were related in community college. And so I went and majored in horticulture, and I loved every minute of it. I thought that I never really realized that there could be that much joy in plants generally. And actually, at that time, I was more focused on landscape plants and not in the food world. And I enjoyed it and did so well in it at the time that I applied for grad school right off the bat, and I started a PhD program right after my bachelor's, and quickly ran out of money and decided not to go load up on student loans, so I went and got a job. And I was working in landscaping for a while, and still had that desire to go to law school. And so applied for law schools and went to law school, and was doing a joint JD MBA. My goal wasn't, at that point, it had transitioned from politics to real estate. And this is a really long story. Transitioned to
That's
real
fine.
estate, and this was in the early 2000s. And I was finishing up my MBA. I finished it in 2007. And if you recall, the real estate market in 2007 was about to take a giant crash. So I was in real estate. I was doing some consulting at the time. I was actually making really good money. And then all of a sudden the floor was dropped out from underneath everything. And I was struggling to make ends meet. Well, I had gotten married about the same time, and my wife is working, and so I had some freedom and decided to start my own landscape company. And at the same time, we found some property to hold all of the landscaping equipment that happened to be on an avocado farm, avocado orchard.
Oh.
And we made ourselves a big garden, and I was just like, oh, I remember how much I really liked this. And about that time, we started having children, and with that, we were thinking about nutrition and lifestyle and things like that. And I thought to myself, I'd probably do really well, in my mind anyways, to focus more on sustainable food and healthy food, and from the growing standpoint. So I started looking to go back to school and finish the PhD, learn what I could about sustainable farming. I decided I wanted to shift to vegetables. So I was looking specifically at sustainable vegetable production. And I called faculty all over the country, and everybody said, sorry, we don't have money. And then I got a random call one day from a professor at Washington State University saying, how would you feel about working in plastics? And I was like, that doesn't sound very sustainable to me.
Right.
And so, but I knew that, grad school was just the stepping stone to academia, and you're not necessarily stuck in the realm in which you go to grad school in. And so I took on a project looking at the use of biodegradable plastic mulch films for producing tomatoes in high tunnels. So that is how that was my path. As far as the small farming thing went, I guess to me, I don't know that my specific expertise is in small farming as much as it is in vegetable production. I would say that if I had personal preferences, I'd probably lean towards small farming, especially when we start the conversation of sustainability, and especially when we contemplate the three legs of that sustainability stool. I think that in large-scale farming, we see a lot of work in economic and environmental sustainability moving forward. But I think the social end of it is completely neglected. And so to me, it's really difficult to manage a program in sustainable agriculture without contemplating labor and community and things like that often are either shunned or overlooked entirely in more large-scale agriculture, at least from my perspective.
So could you say more about the three-legged stool of sustainability?
Sure. When there's always this discussion about what does sustainability mean, and I think the general consensus
That's a good question.
Yeah, well, I honestly don't think that there should be a single answer. I think that sustainability should be highly context dependent, but I think what at least I've gathered is the consensus is that in order to be sustainable, it has to be economically viable, environmentally sound, and socially responsible. And so for any enterprise and in any field, it doesn't necessarily, it's not necessarily just within agriculture that's the case. So I like to keep my answer to that question intentionally vague because I think it should be, because I think it's context dependent.
Interesting. So you, in reading through your bio on the website, you talked about the work you did with plastics and with what is biodegradable. I mean, you did a fair amount of work in that area, obviously. What is that?
So biodegradable plastics are just what you would expect. They're plastics. They're typically
Sounds like an oxymoron to me.
Right.
right? So since the 1950s, polyethylene plastic's been the go-to mulch material and generally plastic material in agriculture. Specifically in mulches, polyethylene's very workable. It's very functional as a mulch. Biodegradable plastic films substitutes that polyethylene with molecules that have the potential to break down completely into nothing but carbon dioxide, water, and microbial biomass. Now, in practice, we've had things on the market since the 80s that have claimed to be biodegradable. And early on, they were not actually biodegradable, but rather they were photodegradable or oxodegradable, meaning that they would weather to the point that they'd fragment. And they might fragment to the point that you don't see them, but they don't actually go away. Mm-hmm. And so when you talk about microplastics and nanoplastics, that's usually either you've got some sort of photo or oxodegradable, some sort of a degradable plastic that doesn't get fully broken down through those microbial processes. So when you're talking about biodegradable, there's several different feedstocks that can be used to create a product that has the potential to break down fully. One of those complicating factors is the soil environment isn't necessarily ideal for the early stages of breakdown. So biodegradation is a two-stage process. Mm-hmm. It starts with weathering, which you have heat, light, water, mm-hmm. and things like that will start to break down the molecules to the point that they shrink up enough that increase the surface area, and once it hits some certain threshold, then the microbes can start going to work on it. But it has to break down enough for them to have access to the molecules to start consuming mm-hmm. them, to complete their own microbial processes. And so once it gets to that point, it tends to speed up, and that's when the biodegradation actually happens.
Does this have to happen in fallow ground, or is it a process that works in ground that's actually in production?
The short answer is it can be either. I think that in production it's probably more effective at the breakdown insofar as, so one of the studies that I did, we looked at post-tillage degradation.
Right.
And I used the word degradation intentionally because we weren't measuring biodegradation. So we didn't have the capacity in the field, in my lab, to measure carbon dioxide evolution in the soil and things like that, and to actually measure the biodegradation. So what we did was we planted a broccoli crop on plastic. We used 2 different biodegradable films and then a non-woven fabric, which is kind of like a landscape fabric. And at the end of the broccoli season, so during the season we measured the amount of visual degradation. So our surrogate for that was how much soil is visible in what was originally mulched. So you'd get pinholes, and then pinholes would open to cracks, and so we'd measure that pre-tillage. Then when we tilled it down, we'd go and get a golf cup cutter. So it was about 4 inches in diameter and 6 inches deep, and we'd pull soil cores and then spend a lot of time sifting out plastic fragments from those soil cores, and we did that every couple of months for 13 months post-tillage. And during that time, we had 2 other tillage events. So there were at least 3 tillage events. We had the one where we tilled it down, and then we had 2 in prepping the beds for the next season. And so when I say that in production it's probably more active, it's because there's more mechanical processes that work on breaking things down small enough for the microbes to actually attack it. And so in that study, we had the non-woven fabric was made out of polylactic acid. I don't know if you remember the
PLA.
PLA. Mm-hmm. The Sun Chips bags that were compostable and obnoxiously loud. Those are PLA, and PLA has the potential to completely biodegrade, but the limitation is that it will only biodegrade at higher temperatures, like what you would find in a municipal compost. So over 150 degrees Fahrenheit, and you're never going to see that in the soil unless you're solarizing and you have the right environment for it. And so it didn't degrade at all. I shouldn't say that. It broke into smaller fragments, but we were still able to capture 100% of what we expected to capture based on what we were sampling. We had another product, and once you get into commercial products, we start talking about trade secrets and proprietary blends. So we don't know exactly what everything's, but
Right.
we have
Right.
our suspicions. But a product that's on the market called BioAgri, that product, over the 13 months post-tillage, we were only able to find about 65% of it after the 13 months. So, from that we extrapolate that 35% breakdown in about a year. And then we had another experimental product that was made out of a class of compounds called polyhydroxyalkanoates, or PHAs. And that one, after 13 months, we weren't able to find. Now, it also performed least well in the field because it broke down faster. Part of that had to do with the manufacturing process, that when it came off the line, it was folded in half. And so that crease where it was folded broke down really quickly. But it also was an experimental product. And so as an experimental product, it may have been manufactured such that it was going to break down faster anyways. But it was still, proof of concept. We weren't able, and we were sifting down to a millimeter square. So we weren't able to find anything bigger than a millimeter square when we were doing our sifting. So
In a land grant environment, which this is, producers could expect or would anticipate being able to go out and reach into the extension communication system to get the information, for example, to go to this sort of make this sort of change. Does that exist in this part of the world? I would presume it would exist in the vegetable growing parts of the world, in the California Central Valleys. But
yeah, so I think that the relevance is probably fairly low for the traditional Kansas crop mix, where you're on a heavy grain rotation. You're not getting a whole lot of plastic out in the field anyways. So it may not have high relevance for the folks here, unless you're talking about some of the smaller farmers that then would be growing vegetables or fruits and use plastics as part of their general routine. With the advent of the internet, it doesn't matter where it was produced. You can now access information on all of that stuff. So, the project that my doctoral work was funded on, and then another subsequent project that was related to that, were all USDA SCRI funded. And, between Washington State University and University of Tennessee, and we also worked a little bit with Texas A&M.
did you, in fact?
Yeah, and so we published several papers on it. We published several fact sheets, and we had established a website, biodegradablemulch.org. I'm not sure if that still gets back to the system now that the grant's gone up. I don't know if UT's still maintaining it. I haven't looked lately, but there's a lot of papers that were compiled there. If anybody wanted to look for more information on biodegradable plastics.
So what do you think the prospects for these are, and both in terms of large-scale production and then the small farmers?
That's a great question, because I recently reviewed an economics fact sheet on biodegradable mulches, where they had done basically the economic analysis for where the break-evens on plastic, switching from regular polyethylene to biodegradable plastics. And so with traditional plastics, you have to remove the plastics from the field. I mean, some people will till them in, and then they're just a mess forever. But in general, you've got to spend the labor to go and cut the mulch, pull the mulch, haul the mulch to the dump, and then pay for dump fees. Because while plastic mulch is potentially recyclable, the access to facilities is relatively low in the U.S. And then having a lot of soil and plant debris on the mulch tends to increase weights, and recyclers don't like to clean them. So unless you're going to clean them, which then is another massive labor expense, then recycling's not an option for most growers.
So, what brought you to K-State?
What brought me to K-State?
Yep.
The job description.
Huh.
That's another story in and of itself. But so this job description was specifically geared towards sustainable, quote-unquote, sustainable agriculture, focused on small-scale farming, regenerative agricultural practices. The word permaculture was used in there, and and it was teaching, and it was running the student farm, and it was everything that I wanted when I went through grad school and was starting to look for jobs and wasn't available when I first graduated. So, Kansas was a big question mark for us. I'd never even driven through Kansas, let alone visited for any period of time before my interview. So,
Yeah.
It's been an interesting transition
I'll bet.
because
Right.
I'll bet so.
a lifelong West Coast resident and native, and coming to the Midwest, there's been some real positive things and then some real negative things, i.e. chiggers.
True.
Totally understandable. What is permaculture?
Permaculture is it's a system of design that's intended to mimic natural systems. So permaculture is coined from combining permanent and agriculture. The idea stemmed from a Tasmanian scientist back in the 1970s. He was influenced by several writers from the early 20th century, late 19th century, with the idea being that if we mimic natural systems, the systems themselves would become more sustainable. So if we provide more of the ecosystem services that a natural ecosystem would provide, say a forest ecosystem, then assuming we can capture the yields that are necessary if we are in a more natural state, or at least design the system so that it performs more of the ecosystem functions of a natural system, that the system would be more resilient and not have some of the potential issues that large-scale monocultures would inherently have.
Interesting. Do you work at all, from any perspective, do you work at all with the Land Institute in Salina? Have you had any overlap there?
I have had some interaction with the Land Institute. We've talked about trying to acquire some of their Kernza product for a research project that we're doing. We were looking for brand specifically, and they don't have brand from Kernza available. And one thing I've found is that, and I don't know if this is a me thing or a Midwest thing or a Kansas thing, but I've had very hard time finding funding for the work that I'm doing. So where my specialty is vegetables, and vegetables isn't a very prominent class of agricultural products in the Midwest, I've found that it's a little bit more difficult to get funding for research. And as a result, things have been a little bit slow on the taking off. I got a good startup package, and so I've been bootstrapping a lot of work that we've been doing, but that'll only go so far.
It's a reality of the research world. Yep.
Yeah. Well, I mean, one of the reason that we were looking at the Kernza brand, I have an interest in integrating crop production. And so one thing that we're looking at, we have a project that's very permaculture related, where we're looking at integrating mushrooms into a vegetable system or fruit system. Strawberries, I guess, were one of the crops we were looking at using. Well, that got us asking some other questions about mushrooms, and so if we were to look at different substrates as far as the protein source in the substrate, is there an impact on yields or quality of the mushrooms later on? So we were going to look at comparing different bran sources. So rice, wheat, and oat bran are very commonly used in bag mushroom production. If we looked at quinoa bran or Kernza bran or buckwheat bran, do these things is there a difference in the protein profiles that would come through in the subsequent mushroom crop? And so we went and looked for these different brand sources, and the closest thing we could find for quinoa brand would have been out of the Netherlands, and buckwheat brand, I think we were looking at Korea or something like that. And Kernza brand doesn't exist unless you make it, and I don't know. In talking to the Land Institute, it didn't sound like the quantity of Kernza could have been available to us in any kind of a short order, given that we needed 50 pounds of bran. And not just grain.
You would have needed 400 pounds of Kernza.
Yeah, so we're going to start off with just doing the rice, oat, and wheat and look at the protein profile of the subsequent mushroom crop and see if there's any big difference. So we'll look at the 3 different bran sources. We're getting the bran analyzed right now as far as nitrogen and micronutrients, and then we're also going to do different levels of protein, or nitrogen as our analog for protein, just to see how that affects the mushroom crop in the bags.
Do you see mushrooms as a a solid cropping potential in this area for small producers?
Well, it definitely has potential insofar as mushrooms can be produced in a garage, in a closet, in a high tunnel.
Right.
The mushrooms, I mean, they feed on dead things, and you can put dead things anywhere. I mean, that's maybe a little overly bland, or not bland, but coy. But the reality is if you have a carbon source and you have a nitrogen source, then you can basically grow mushrooms. I mean, there's more to it. But I've seen mushrooms grown on logs in a woodlot. Now, woodland is a little bit less prevalent in Kansas, but I've also seen it grown under shade cloths. So what we're doing out at the student farm, our project that I mentioned that's permaculture related, we have a project that we've started that's using hugelkulture as a system for, we're looking at season extension using hugelkulture. And I guess I should step back. Hugelkulture is German for mound culture or hill culture, and it's basically creating large windrowed mounds that then could be used to grow crops on. Currently, there is nothing in the literature about hugelkulture. It's all popular press, anecdotal stuff. And so, as far as research goes, it's wide open. It's also impossible to get funding for because there's nothing to say, hey, here's what somebody else did and let's build on that. So what we're going to do is we're going to look at shady side versus sunny side, whether or not, the shady side will extend a cool season crop later into the summer for us, whether the sunny side can help us get in earlier, get out earlier with successional planting. But then we thought, we've got these mounds, we're going to irrigate them for the vegetable crop or the fruit crop if we put strawberries on them. And because that moisture will be maintained in the soil, what if we laid down some mushroom logs at the base and at the top of this, and to see if we could produce a mushroom crop at the same time with that we were thinking with little extra effort. Now, drilling mushroom logs is no small feat, especially when you're drilling about 1,000 feet of them.
I'm aware of a local farmer that has mushroom logs growing shiitake mushrooms.
Yeah, so 1,000
Not
feet
a
of
small
mushroom
effort.
logs is it took us about 5 or 6 months to get through it. I mean, not full time, obviously.
Yeah. No.
It was no small feat. My grad student, I think, wants to kick me.
They
So
won't when they start producing mushrooms.
That's right.
So that system, I think, might have some potential. We'll see. We were approaching it from a more commercial aspect as far as what the potential benefits could be. One, because I thought that would be more fundable if we were looking at season extension for commercial crops. The flip side of that is if I was to bring an economist into it, the amount of labor involved in building these mounds has been surprisingly large. But, if you've got a lot of extra wood material that you're, say, trimming out of an orchard or trimming out of a riparian area or cleaning up a roadside, if you have access to a lot of woody material, hugelkulture might be a more environmentally sound method of disposing of that wood than burning it.
Sure.
Right.
Having all that carbon dioxide float off into the atmosphere. Instead, you can bury it and sequester it for a much longer period of time.
That's fascinating. It really is. Really, really is.
Could you say more about the student farm?
Sure. So the student farm currently comprises about 8 acres of what is the Geyer Forestry Research Center that's part of K-State. It's located at the Tuttle Creek State Park. It's not part of the park, but you have to access it from the park. The Geyer Research Center is about 60 acres, and it has a lot of long-term forestry research happening there. So in 2008, my predecessor, Rhonda Yonke, was able to carve out about 3 acres of that and started the student farm where we have a student farm club here that's housed in the horticulture department, and those students and other interested students and sometimes faculty through their courses will bring students out to work on the farm, to teach on the farm. And the farm had sat fallow, so to speak, for about 2 years between the last time it was actively managed and once I was able to get it managed again, maybe a year and a half. But we hired a full-time farm manager last January, and this last year we produced 8,000 pounds of produce for Derby and Kramer dining halls.
Wow.
Wonderful.
JP's Sports Grill at the Union, and then the Little Grill. out on Dyer
Oh,
Road
sure.
purchased
Yeah.
some stuff
That's
from us
great.
just because they couldn't get more local than us.
Nope, you're right
No,
across
right
the
there,
street.
down the
Yeah.
yeah.
So we're literally right across
Yeah.
the street from the little grill. So we're producing mostly vegetables right now. There had been an orchard that was planted a few years ago using money from the Green Action Fund here at K-State, but because of lack of management, there was some deer got in there.
Ah,
They will
yes.
do that.
We had a lot of rubbing damage on
Yep.
most of those
Right.
trees. There's 3 trees that still put up green leaves, but it's just a matter of time before they go. They've been completely girdled by deer rubbing. So at some point, my intent is to plant another orchard. In fact, with the permaculture theme, there's this idea of food forests, which is a multi-level or multi-tiered polyculture system that focuses on food-producing plants, but planted in a massive polyculture, and comparing the potential productivity of that system compared to a more traditional orchard system. And so we have the space now. We were able to expand the farm from the 3 acres that it was originally. I guess I should say it's more 7 acres. There's another about acre of the shop and the
Sure, the
equipment
buildings
storage
and
area and stuff like
Dependencies,
that.
yeah.
Yeah, but
Right.
that's shared with the Geyer folks. So yeah, we have plans, and this last summer we piloted a small farm practicum out at the farm. We had 8 students sign up, and they took on a project for the summer. And one student's project was an aquaculture project. He started.
Nice.
We were able to get some IBC totes, food grade IBC totes that he's installed and created. We've got goldfish out there that have survived the winter so far. And in fact, I just met with a professor in biology that's interested in doing some work on the emotions of those fish and
Oh, that's
brain
awesome.
chemistry and stress and
Yeah.
how that works. So I don't know if anything will come of that. I think it would be fantastic to collaborate on something like that. And that particular system was built so that it could be expanded. We currently have 1 bed, 1 fish tank. We could probably fit 4 more fish tanks and about 9 or 10 more beds. So it's expandable. We have 2 high tunnels, so the aquaculture is in one of the high tunnels. We have another high tunnel that's specifically for vegetable production. Interestingly, our soil test last year said that we had something like 400 pounds of nitrogen per acre in the soil there. So either somebody spilled something,
Yeah.
or I don't know what
Huge,
happened,
yeah.
but we've been gladly soaking that up with our vegetable crops. So we had some amazing eggplant and peppers in there last season, as well as tomatoes. And
Is there any
Yeah.
potential of doing work with the Cat's Cupboard here? I know that they're just down the hall from where we're recording this.
Yep. I don't know if we've already started, but I know that we've had conversations with Cat's Cupboard about
Okay.
providing some fresh produce there. My farm manager, so Reagan Hale, is our new farm manager here, and she's been doing a great job of reaching out to folks. And I know she's had conversations with Cat's Cupboard. I don't know the status.
I
of it
know
right
there's
now,
some
so-
limitations with what they can handle in there.
Yeah.
I think it's all just dry and shelf stable at this point in time.
which
but-
is not what we're.
Not
which
what
is
you're
not,
doing,
yeah,
no.
no. But the idea of being able to help the hungry students on campus, which it's an issue. I mean, availability of food to students here is an issue. Thinking
Yeah.
that there's a good potential link there, but it's interesting to know that you're already supplying those vegetables to student housing and the food services there. That's great.
So what do you, so the students who are working on the farm there, and then I'm curious what their interest and path is, and it's related to another thing that I want to love for you to talk about a little bit more, and the role of small farms, right, in general, right? So there's lots of different small farm things. Some of them, as a business, as a livelihood. Some of it's just the backyard thing, and some of it's like small is relative too, right? So there are some very
Sure,
large small farms, right? So could you just say something about like what your interests are and what kinds of things you want to sort of see happen?
So the first part of your question was, what are the students'
Yeah, right.
interests? And I should probably poll them at some point. And I do when I teach class, what are your interests? And I'd say that the vast majority are there because it's a major requirement for our hort production majors that they take either fruit or vegetable production. I would say that there's a small proportion of our horticulture students that actually want to get into fruits or vegetables, some sort of food-producing horticultural crop or cropping system. And so for those students, they tend to be our regulars out at the farm. I guess my vision for the student farm has been since I got here, and what I interviewed on was the idea of creating the premier small to mid-scale diversified food training center, like farming training center in the Midwest. And that's kind of a very narrow definition, but at the same time, it's something that doesn't really exist. There are some farms that do training, mostly private and mostly in the city environment. So over in Kansas City and St. Louis, I've seen some operations that are doing farm training like that. And our extension offices do quite a bit of it as well, especially in the urban counties in Kansas. So for me, I'd love to be able to get people out there for workshops, and we've been talking about trying to establish a harvest festival, some sort of a conference / just celebration out at the farm at the end of the season.
It's a great idea.
That is a great idea.
Yeah, but we could definitely use more help as far as people go in getting that done. The students seem really excited about it, but at the same time, they tend to be busier than what would be required of having the students help us organize that. And Reagan's focused a lot on creating a plan and executing that plan for growing produce out there and marketing that produce and whatnot. But it's on our agenda. In fact, we've been developing the idea, what we've come to is that we have to grow pumpkins so that we can have a pumpkin chunk in it at this event. And we need to grow enough tomatoes that we can have a Dunk-a-Professor, like a dunk tank, but with tomatoes in the tank instead of water.
Dunkadine would be even better, actually.
Right? That would be fantastic. Who's the sucker? They've all said it's got to be me. So, that's been the limitation, is just manpower right now for getting that off the ground and some funding. But we have big plans for the farm. We've already the Save Farm or the Save organization, service members, agricultural vocation education. They've had their bees out there for years. They've been out there helping the students with field prep and doing some of the work as far as tractor work. When there wasn't somebody who knew how to use the tractor, they'd have somebody out there that would happily go till for us. They've done a beekeeping last summer when we had our small farm practicum. They did a beekeeping workshop for the students, and so it's been a somewhat fruitful relationship there, and I hope that continues. And we've been working with the Kansas Permaculture Institute, and this summer we're planning to offer a permaculture design certification course. We've still been going back and forth as to whether or not we want to offer it for credit, because the timing would be such that it would have to go through Global Campus, and there's a lot of costs involved in putting on that, and saddling students with higher costs of Global Campus fees, plus the cost of putting on the course, plus the cost of tuition. It's just been something that we've been struggling with as to whether or not that's feasible for students without, saddling them with more debt in doing that. So, but we are putting on the course. So the last week and a half before the fall semester this year, out at the student farm, we'll be putting on that course, and that information can be found at the KPI's website, which is kansaspermaculture.org.
Are these sorts of approaches amenable to cooperative sorts of undertakings? Could you have a group of owners of land that Southern Kansas had an egg co-op at one time. There have been other sorts of co-ops. I just wondered if this particular type of farming had any advantages or disadvantages.
Cooperative efforts in the food system are highly, I think they're underutilized and would be favorable to one, approaching that leg of sustainability and social responsibility.
Right.
I was previously the director of extension for Spokane County in Washington. And in Spokane County, we had started a food hub called Link Foods. And Link Foods had started with 30 farmers or farms. And it started basically as a marketing cooperative for those farmers. So the big boon for farmers there was that Spokane's two major economic drivers currently is education and healthcare. So there's 3 universities in the Spokane area. There's also 2 major hospitals and several other medical centers in that area. And as institutional buyers, small farmers have a really hard time accessing those markets because of insurance requirements. So where some of these folks are requiring $5 million in liability insurance in order to purchase food, most small farmers don't have that.
They can't
kind
carry
of,
that. No.
Yeah. So the co-op, the big benefit for farmers, aside from the marketing, was that for $100 a year, they had a joint liability policy that would allow those farmers to access those institutional markets. And so for the first several years, Gonzaga University was the biggest buyer from the cooperative. And so we have these small farmers that would have never been able to sell to the big institutional buyers now able to sell into Gonzaga. And Gonzaga was doing a great job. They had a local food initiative. They were their goal was to provide 20% of their dining menu from the local area. And so they were highlighting farms in their menus at the restaurants on campus and in the dining halls on campus. They were buying a lot of local food. And that was great. It really got the co-op off to a good start. The co-op's also selling into the school district. They're doing a food of the month or a vegetable of the month type of thing. They're selling into the hospitals now. They started a CSA. So for all the farmers that had all this produce, they'd post it on the website where buyers would go and basically pick and choose what they wanted. But not everything would sell, and so for those things that wouldn't sell, then everything was brought into the CSA, and then the co-op was just offloading people's extras into the CSA, which, at first we had some farmers that were like, what do you mean you're going to do a CSA? You're going to compete with my CSA? But the reality was that it was a great outlet for the majority of farmers to offload those things that they weren't selling. So it was a huge benefit to the farmers. It was a great benefit to the community as far as just recognizing that we actually had agriculture really close to Spokane. Spokane's at the very north edge of the Palouse region, which is a massive grain-growing region, probably the most productive grain-growing region in the country, if not the world, as far as per-acre yields go. Right. But the vast majority of that wheat all gets shipped out to Japan. So, even though it's a massive agricultural region, nobody's eating local grains there because it's all getting exported. There's a couple of producers now that have started to focus on the local grains, and in fact, part of the cooperative, they started a malt house, and they're doing local malt, which of course all of the microbreweries and home brewers there are just dying for it. They just think it's the greatest thing ever that they're using Palouse-grown grains in their malts and in their beers. So
you see small flickers of those things you're describing in this area, and I suspect it's probably population, if nothing else. What do you see the potential for those kinds of activities, certainly locally, but even in other areas around the state?
Yeah, so I definitely think population has something to do with it, as well as just ingrained culture. So Kansas is the wheat state, and even if corn and soy may be passing up wheat,
longer maybe, but
the reality is it's a grain state, and that's staple crop, but not necessarily where people are looking at getting the variety and nutrition from their diet. And so I guess I shouldn't ignore beef, but
at your peril, in this
right. But then where's the beef going? I mean, even the beef is going to be exported out of the state, and for the most part. So I think population is probably the key driver. You have to have enough population so that subset of the population who really wants to have local foods is there. But again, the culture here in Kansas may not be quite as focused on local because we have such a global mindset when it comes to our agriculture that who's thinking local. I think it's going to be a smaller proportion than states like Washington or California or coastal states on either coast. And so, if you get closer to Kansas City and Wichita, you're starting to have that population.
I was just going to ask if you're seeing that increase in the larger cities.
So in fact, this
state.
weekend I was just giving a couple of talks at the Wichita had a farmers market entrepreneurship workshop and food producer entrepreneurship workshop, and I think a lot of that is evidence that we have that. Maybe not critical mass, but we have enough mass that we're approaching critical mass for creating those kinds of environments in those cities. I think Kansas City's probably farther along than Wichita, isn't it? It's a function of being
wouldn't surprise me that, yeah.
Bigger cities and having more people both growing and eating, and But I think there has to be that critical mass of people who want local food, and then you have to have the growers who are willing to stick their necks out to either create a co-op and a food hub, or to just buck the system and flip for that institutional policy.
Keep
or
pushing it. And
to push the envelope.
Well, I've seen certainly in Manhattan, in this area, there is a small population that supports that, and it's a pretty strong group, but it is not large.
Yeah.
You're right. It's just
Well, and I mean, to be economically viable, you need enough buyers to make
right. Absolutely.
your
Market.
production worthwhile. So there are farmers who farm out of what's the word? It's almost charity.
Mm-hmm.
How many of our small farmers are just doing it as a hobby, and they have off-farm income to support it? And when I was farming while I was in Spokane, and it was great on my taxes because I'd get a little bit of a write-off every year. But at the same time, we were eating really well.
So could you talk about more about these social aspects? I mean, so the you're just saying that the prospects for some of these initiatives and for small farming and maybe some of the permaculture stuff depends on a population of people who are interested. How do you shift that? Should we shift this? Should you just be working for the people who are already interested? Would you like to see, more of a shift in the population? How do you make these things happen?
It's a really tough question. You could approach it from several different angles. We as a society are so focused on convenience when it comes to food that we tend to ignore nutrition, and we see that in our health bills, our medical bills, and things like that. Obesity rates, cancer rates. People are not feeding themselves well because they don't take the time to feed themselves well.
Mm-hmm.
And how do you overcome that? I don't know. It's something that you either have to start in the home with young kids in school, but then, is that where the money is as far as education goes? Is in nutrition education, or is it in STEM?
Mm-hmm.
Should these things be the same? Maybe they should.
That was my first thought. That it's part of the same programs.
Yeah. And then there's also the mindset in production side, especially in large scale production. We have this call to save or feed the world.
Mm-hmm.
And when I think of that statement and through the lens of sustainability or social responsibility and sustainability, if your farmer's going out of business, that person can now not feed their family.
Mm-hmm.
And if our goal is to feed the world, I think we need to have the perspective that starts from home. And if we have farmers going out of business and having to go move to the city because they're bankrupt, because their yield this year fell off below that critical threshold of keeping them in business, maybe we should give pause to the dominant mindset of, get bigger, get out, because that's not socially sustainable. That's why our rural communities are crumbling, is because we have farms that are getting so big, they're bigger than big cities.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
And is that sustainable? I could play into some of the fears of certain classes of people, and you get to where the farm's so big, what's the end result of that consolidation? The end result is one farm, one farmer, and when that happens, who's that farmer? We talked to some conservatives out there, and they might be concerned about having the government run all the food production. But that's the ultimate end of that policy of get bigger, get out, is that you have consolidation to the point that it's one farm, one farmer.
Mm-hmm.
And who is that?
Mm-hmm. So
that could be positive, that could be negative. Right. I think most people would probably think of that as a fairly negative thing. And when you have farm sizes in the tens of thousands of acres, it's not conducive to community and social responsibility.
Right. Yeah. So that's what I was just going to say. So small farming, at least for you, is partly about the community and support for the community, and sort of having population centers where there's more than one farmer around. Sort of.
Sure.
Right, yeah.
Well, and the flip side of that is there was a time where everybody was a farmer and everybody helped their neighbor out, and that sounds quaint and delightful to some people. I mean, I think it'd be great if there was some more of that, but at the same time, Now you're talking about economic viability and the ability of our society to advance technologically, economically, and there's this conflict between communities that stay intact and neighbors who like each other and will help each other, and being able to advance economically. And where do where's the sweet spot between those? And I don't have the answer to that, and I doubt anybody does, because it's so subjective and will vary from person to person. But what I can say is that, in the regime of consolidation that we're in, it's definitely not good for communities, and it's not good for the social sustainability of the system generally.
Yeah, that's you take people out to towns that had better days, and you hear them saying, well, where did they all go? Where are they now? And the answer is just almost every place.
Right. They've moved out.
Everywhere but here.
But here, that's right.
About a month ago, we did a podcast with a historian here on campus that has done a lot of work on farming in the Southern Great Plains, and we got into a discussion about small towns in the state of Kansas and just the thousands of them that are just not there anymore, that have just disappeared. And they're continuing to disappear because, as you said, you've got these farms that are 10,000 acres plus.
And where do your neighbors live?
You don't have neighbors, and you
and
don't have a need.
how far away is your hospital?
Well, people complain that their kids don't want to stay on the farm anymore, and so they have to sell because they don't have anybody to pass it on to, or with that general thing. But you have to look at what's the cause of that. If there's no community for the children to have friends and activities and things like that, so it becomes a chicken and egg question. Do you preserve the community to keep the community, or do you preserve the farm to keep the farm? And those two things don't seem to go together anymore. You can't preserve the farm and the community, at least in the dominant global paradigm of agriculture.
Well, at the very start, we talked a bit about some of the other research that was being done here on campus and what positive impact that can have, or just direct relationship it can have with the smaller farming operations. There's a lot of work being done also in Feed the Future labs, which I'm sure you're aware of, and small farming globally, not just within the state of Kansas. And if I think I'm correct in that small farming basically is a growing enterprise worldwide.
Well, small farming has always been, by the numbers, the most numerous as far as the numbers go. There have always been more small farms than big farms, and that's just a function of they're small farms, and they're easier to start, they're cheaper to start, and they're less capital intensive and all that. I do think that in the U.S. there's a growing interest in small farms, but at the same time there's also it's really hard to sell a local potato in any market that's grown on a small farm when you're competing against large farms in imports from the Northwest or wherever. And so I think there's this tension between the desire for producing and consuming local foods and the ability to afford local foods. Where you've got a lot of these commodity crops are subsidized through crop insurance and things like that. It's not necessarily something that's accessible to small farms, and as a result, they're having to charge the full price of what food should cost because they're actually paying for all of their
production
inputs and the production costs, versus the larger scale farms that are focused on one crop where there is an insurance policy to help them overcome yield deficiencies and things like that. And so it makes it really hard for small farms to compete, even for those people who might be more inclined to buy local. If they can't afford it, they can't afford it.
Well, when looking, again, kind of stepping back to the science, to some of the research that's happening there, I think I remember one of the gentlemen working in the Feed the Future labs talking about, and I don't remember specifically what the measurement was, but introducing some of these higher technologies to small farmers, where you've got a small farmer in Africa capable of using his phone with an app and a camera of some sort to actually do measurements. Do you see that kind of connection between some of these research activities and small farming practices, or is there still a pretty big gap between newer technologies and what's actually happening on the small farms?
Well, from what I have seen, I haven't seen much use of that kind of high technology. In fact, I wasn't even aware that there's an app on your phone that you can take pictures and.
Yeah,
Good for you.
I may have totally misunderstood what he was saying
Well, I
too.
mean, no, and I can totally see the applicability of that. We're talking, there's drones that are used for that kind of a
Sure.
thing. And I've seen in Washington State, I had a colleague in Extension that had got a drone that he installed some of these cameras to be able to go out and do assessments of smaller fields. I think vegetable systems tend to be smaller in general than than the grain systems, and so as a result, you know, a 100-acre farm is a large vegetable farm, at least in some places. Some places 100 is still small, but that's accessible for using a drone. You can fly a drone over 100 acres in a couple of hours and then have some data back really quickly. And there are farmers that I know that are doing that. As far as the handheld device, I think if I was an urban farmer and I had access to that, I'd love to be able to use that kind of a technology in order to save myself some money on fertility or, you know, maybe early detection for a disease or pest. That would be great. I think that would be embraced, but at the same time, you know, I subscribe to a grower magazine called Growing for Market, and I don't see that kind of technology being advertised in that kind of an outlet, which would be something that small scale farmers would read and look
That's where
at.
they would
So
find that. Yeah,
that's one place. I mean, in Kansas, we do have some vegetable specialists in our extension, but not too many, and I don't know what they're putting out, but that would be the kind of thing that if it was there, I'd love to see them putting that kind of information in the hands of growers. But I'd be fascinated by it. I think it would be great if it was applicable at that scale.
Yeah, I forget how much that was aspirational or experimental still, or if, I don't think
I
I
suspect
don't think
it
that
was
particular
probably
project was. Yeah, I don't think
aspirational.
that one was
Yeah.
yet describing something
an
in
actual
production. But
product, but
yeah.
and
I'd
it
be
may
all
have
for
been
it. Yeah.
Yeah.
in the aspirational side of it. I mean, in my mind, I can see some of that kind of thing happening.
Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah.
I can perceive that that's possible
That would
to
be
be
great.
able to go out and and
Use your smartphone, snap a picture, and know how much nitrogen you need to put
Yeah.
on
Right.
yeah
that week.
yeah
That would
Yeah.
be amazing.
yeah.
In a contour plot.
It's been a great conversation.
It's
It
been
absolutely has. This has been spectacular.
We've about
Well,
killed
Well, hopefully
an
I
hour.
haven't
Yeah.
put my foot in my mouth anyway.
Ah,
too
well,
have-
we'll see.
No,
I
this
don't think
is
so.
It was great.
Yeah, my coming to vegetables might have been a little long.
No,
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 not
I
at
don't
all.
think so.
not at all. Do you have any follow-up questions for us?
Oh, I hadn't even thought about that.
Mhm.
Well, I guess it would be great to come up with collaborations with folks. I mean, we have the student farm, and we have the ability to test some things on a smaller scale that may be applicable to small farms. But if it has applicability outside of that scale as well, I mean, we just acquired some emmer wheat, some
Oh, sure.
Ethiopian blue-tinged
Yeah.
emmer wheat, with the idea of trying to do some intercropping work with it.
Nice.
I don't know if you're familiar with Masanobu Fukuoka's One Straw Revolution.
Mm-hmm.
It was one of those that inspired some of the Back to the Land and some of those kinds of movements in the 70s and
Oh, okay.
60s. But he was a plant pathologist with the Japanese government and left to go back to his family farm, and over 40 years had developed this system of intercropping where dryland rice was his primary crop, and he was intercropping a winter grain as a cover for the winter, and he had root crops like radish and things like that, and then vegetable crops, and he had them all intercropped together. And he said it took him about 20 years to finally master it, but at that point all he was doing was a little bit of sowing and a lot of reaping. And the system basically ran itself, and he claims in the book that at that point, 20 years into it, that he was achieving greater per acre yields on his rice than the paddy systems were in conventional agriculture
Wow.
in
Amazing.
Japan. So I was thinking to myself, if we could come up with a system that worked in the Great Plains with, rice probably isn't the best one to go with here, but, So, I mean, we were going to look at the emmer wheat. I picked the emmer because Costco stopped carrying their farrow wheat, and we were really big fans of it, and I'd buy some of that wheat from the farm if we were able to get it grown.
So if there are students who are interested in being out on the farm, or do you have
Oh.
room for a lot more, or
So
what?
actually, we just got our small farm practicum approved for the catalog. It's now Hort 591. I do have a prerequisite in there that you've taken either fruit or vegetable production, but for non-majors, we've been making exceptions to get them out there and try to utilize what skills they've been developing in their own programs to help the farm grow. So we had a marketing student out there last summer that helped us market our field day that we put on. So it'd be great if people were interested and wanted to work out on the farm. There's the Hort 591 that'll be offered this summer and next fall. Our student farm club, they meet generally on Thursdays, and they also get out to the farm most Saturdays to have work days. This last Saturday, the previous week, I had tapped some maple trees, so they went out on Saturday and collected some water from the maple trees, and we're boiling that down, and we're all super amused to see how you can go from, as one person put it, water that tasted like I was licking a tree to sweet, sweet, sugary goodness.
That's amazing.
So we have work days out there on a regular basis on Saturdays, and so
And
there
you
are
have
opportunities.
students that work on local farms as well, I'm aware of,
Right.
and
Yeah.
intern on some of the local farms, and so that's I think there's potential available around the area for
True.
those that are interested. Yeah.
Yeah.
And for other people who are interested in permaculture, small farming, techniques in general, the kinds of things that you're working on, and where do they turn?
So Extension's always a good place to turn, especially in the counties that have Hort agents. The Kansas Permaculture Institute's a great place to look for information on permaculture, especially education in permaculture. At some point, I'd like to put on the catalog a permaculture course. There's currently an Intro to Permaculture course on the catalog, but it's an Ag Ideas course that's delivered through North Carolina State. I think we've had 4 students take it in the last 5 years. So it hasn't been big, but I think if we were to get that established here on campus, I know University of Kansas has a permaculture design course they offer every semester, and they've been getting 20 to 30 students
Nice.
per semester to take that. So I think it would be a benefit to have.
Great.
Well, thanks so much for being here.
Yes,
Yeah,
thanks a
thank
bunch.
you.
Thank you very much. This was great. If you have any questions or comments you would like to share, check out our website at ksu.edu/research/global food and drop us an email. Our music was adapted from Wayne Gowen's album, Chronicles of Carmela. Special thanks to him for providing that to us. Something to Chew On is produced by the Office of Research Development at Kansas State University.